Do you sometimes wonder how you could truly have an impact when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do you know you are moving in the right direction when it comes to becoming a more inclusive individual? As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod brings topics such as ethnicity, genders, sexuality, or religion on the table. We talk about research and science, but also emotions, feelings, and vulnerability. We discuss allyship, advocacy, and privilege. But most importantly, we talk action. Because without action, we stay still. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, stillness is never the answer. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. In this episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod, I have the immense pleasure to welcome Ritu Kiran Jackson. Ritu is the founder and CEO of Aubilities, an organization that aims to raise awareness of autism and how to support the neurodiverse within organizations. She's an HR and Neurodiversity Consultant, a trainer, a writer, and a keynote speaker, sharing insights, raising awareness, and building acceptance of the neurodiverse with a specialism in autism. She has over 12 years of experience in consulting and HR and has published organization-wide articles on autism spanning 10,000 employees around the globe. She's a reviewer of academic papers around Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD, and an accessibility speaker to pupils of special educational needs schools, with a link to ASD or learning difficulties. Ritu and I explore the topic of building acceptance of autism and helping organizations become more inclusive with neurodiverse talents. Ritu, welcome. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on the podcast. I'm really grateful to have you here today and have the chance to hear about you, to hear about what you're doing, and to dive a little bit deeper on that diversity, equity, and inclusion podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Julian. A pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Same as well. Looking forward to it. Well, the first question I'd like to ask you actually is, Ritu, what's your story?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So maybe I'll start with a little bit of a background on myself. So I was born and raised in the UK. I went to King's College London and University of Oxford and got my formal degrees from there. And after which I joined Accenture Management Consulting. And I did that for quite a large part of my career before I moved kind of in-house to different organizations. And I always stayed within the space of HR, but moving towards different teams, departments, and functions within HR. So I've done that for quite a large time of my life, coming up to, I think, 15 years or so. And in that time, as most people do, I got married and I had my first child. Kyan is his name. And when Kyan was age 2, he was diagnosed with autism. Mm-hmm. And so as first-time parents, we really didn't know a lot about autism. We'd kind of heard about it, but we didn't know too much. So that's kind of where all the research started and all of the support groups and accessing the autistic community, et cetera, et cetera. But it was actually a year after that, I had a near-death experience. And in that near-death experience, I said to myself, if I survive this, I'm going to do something different with my life and I'm going to help the autistic community. I'm going to use my corporate skills and my HR skills and help the autistic community. And that's where that story actually started. So I did survive. Luckily, I'm still here. And I opened up my own organization called Aubilities. It stands for Autism plus Abilities. And we do a wide variety of services that we offer, but ultimately our goal is to help the autistic community within employment.
Amazing! This is a beautiful story, and as you said, glad you everything went well, and you're here to be able to share that story and everything you're doing now with us as well.
Yeah.
So as you said, you focus a lot with Aubilities on the autism spectrum, and I think probably one question I would want to ask you first, which is more to kind of create that awareness, because I think as you shared through your story as well, is when it started in with you and your child was diagnosed with autism at 2, you didn't know much about it. And I think there is still very much that the thing amongst most of us, that we don't really know much about it. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what does autism mean, and maybe kind of a bit debunking some of these stereotypes that we may have.
Yeah, absolutely. So autism is a neurological condition, right? There are many others. For example, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, etc. There are many others, and autism is one condition.
Mhm.
However, autism is slightly different to the rest, whereas it has a spectrum, and the spectrum is not linear. It's you can have different traits if you're autistic, which can represent different things. So to give you a really simplistic definition, the World Health Organization define autism as someone who has atypical patterns of behavior. So they might have difficulty transitioning from one activity to another, as one example. They could have difficulty in focusing on details or be really good at details. They could have unusual reactions to sensations like your taste or your touch or your sight and things like that. And so if I go back to the notion of a spectrum, the idea is that someone who is on the autistic spectrum can have a variety of different traits, and these traits can be different from person to person. So to give you an idea of some common traits, some people with autism may struggle with processing information. So they look at the world differently, and the way they process information can be different, right? Some people might struggle with understanding social cues and norms. Some people might have an adverse reaction to change. So they like familiarity, they like routine, right? And there's many other things. We can talk about the traits in more detail in just a moment. But the idea of the spectrum is that no single person who has autism is the same as the next person who has autism. They're completely different, because when you look at the traits they have, when you look at how mild or severe each trait might be, and then combine that with their own personality, which of course would be based on nature and nurture, you really have what they say is a saying: if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So you cannot take a blanket approach and say, hey, I met this person with autism, that's how all autistic people may be. So hopefully that helps a little bit defining kind of what autism is about and how it prevails within people who have autism. But you mentioned something about debunking some stereotypes. So I just, again, just to reiterate the point, it's around an individual who's on the spectrum. So you can't say each person will be exactly the same as this. And a lot of people have stereotypes of people with autism from things they might have seen on TV. So, for example, Rain Man, the movie, now that had a particular view of autism, but it doesn't mean everyone's like that particular character. Or most recently, there's a Netflix series called Atypical, and again, it portrays an autistic character, and people may watch that thinking, okay, now they understand autism, but actually, it's only representing one facet of autism. Right? So I think it's really important to know that. If you come across people on the spectrum, they really truly are individuals. And if you meet someone who has particular traits, it doesn't mean the next person that you meet with autism will have those same traits.
And I think it's a very interesting point you're making here, because indeed the way we probably, when we spoke to each other a few months ago, I think for me one of the things I mentioned is, of course, I've seen people with autism around me, but I've never necessarily interacted with them because simply of the community I had around me, and I didn't have the chance to. But indeed, that vision quite often is the vision we have from media or movies or series that we watch, which I think tend sometimes to portray as well maybe someone who are a bit more severe in that spectrum, which are not necessarily, as you said, those different individuals that we may interact with. And I think what I want to jump to here is actually understand a little bit more what the work you're doing with organizations now in terms of bringing that diversity in the workplace.
Yeah, and this is a huge topic, right? Because so neurodiversity is obviously a hidden disability, and this has really come to the forefront in recent years, right? In terms of governments are now starting to pay more attention, organizations are starting to pay more attention. Some organizations like Microsoft, SAP, JP Morgan Chase, and EY, they've come together and said, hey, we're gonna make a change here. We're going to put together a autism at work program to help people with autism find jobs, right, and employment.
Yep.
But let's rewind a little bit. I mean, why is this an issue? Why did Aubilities decide to work in a particular area that also emphasizes and helps this campaign? Well, when we look and think about autism, what's happened is the diagnosis rates are going up globally across the entire globe. The diagnosis rates are going up, and there's a multitude of reasons why. There is, for example, improved awareness, improved diagnostic tools, improved criteria of what is now defined as autism. So, for example, Asperger's never used to be under autism, and now it is. And there's now more reporting as well. So people are now reporting more on autism. So we can see that the number of cases are rising over the past, say, 20 years, right? And so now, because we're seeing the number of cases rise, we understand, okay, there may be something we may have to do here. Because when we start looking into studies and papers, published papers, academic papers on what's out there, what we're seeing is there is a huge amount of the autistic community that are not in full-time paid employment. And when we look at where are these statistics, well, they vary, right? So when we look at, for example, say the entire globe, the statistic currently is 1 in every 270 people have autism, right? Or are autistic. But when we look at specific countries, in particular high-income countries like the UK, that ratio changes to 1 in 100. If we look at Australia, it's 1 in 70. If we look at the US, it's 1 in 54. So there is a huge amount in terms of a population of people who have been diagnosed with autism, right? But really the concern is that population that's been diagnosed, what we're finding is they are struggling to get into employment, full-time paid employment. Not all of them, but there is a large proportion of them. So again, if we look at some statistics for particular high-income countries, in the UK, about 84% of people who are on the spectrum are not in full-time paid employment, right? Yep. And that statistic for the US is about 85%, Canada is about 86%. So there is something here in terms of a story that it's telling. We've got a huge population, a growing population of people being diagnosed with autism, and also a growing population of those people who are diagnosed not in full-time paid employment. Yet, when we do some research, we find that actually over 70% want to be. So it's not that they don't want to be. They're finding that there are barriers in them entering the workforce, right? Yes. So let's go back to the Microsoft, the SAP, the JP Morgan Chase, and the EY. They got together and they said, hey, we recognize that these people have a different set of abilities. And actually, in all the research that's been done recently about having a diverse team and having a diverse workforce and what benefits that can add to the organization in terms of tangible and intangible benefits, they also recognize we need to start hiring people from the autistic talent pool, because actually what we're missing out in terms of diversity is a different way of thinking, right? Yep. And these people can provide that different way of thinking. So those 4 organizations got together. They started the Autism at Work program. They created a playbook. They said, hey, we are not in competition with each other. We're going to actually help other organizations do the same thing. So they created a playbook that's open to anyone who wants to do a similar program within their organization to help hire and retain people who are on the spectrum, right? So I think it was just important for me to highlight kind of the historical context and why it's important to hire people from the autistic talent pool, right? And if we go into the work that Aubilities is doing, so we very much look at the autistic community as assets, right? You just need to tap into the right type of people for the right role and harness the right skills. So what we're doing is trying to help organizations see that and help them towards that movement, right? So we offer, I guess, well, our mission, I'll start with our vision and mission. So our vision is to help organizations with increasing value from their people by using neurodiversity like autism. Yeah. And twofold, helping the autistic community gain meaningful employment, right? Because we all know that employment and having a job gives us purpose in life. It gives us meaning in life, as well as financial stability. So it's super important, right? And then we want to achieve that through our mission, which is to raise awareness of autism So like you mentioned already, Julian, there is some awareness out there, but still there's lots of people who don't know. We didn't know when our son was diagnosed, like we weren't entirely sure of it. So there's still more to be done with raising awareness, but raising awareness is not enough, right? So yes, we want to raise awareness of autism, but then we want to build acceptance, which means helping organizations make their organization more inclusive for the neurodiverse, specifically people with autism, right? And then the third thing we do is promote diversity. So you can truly say you have a differentiated workforce when you've got people from all different backgrounds, which includes people with hidden disabilities and neurological differences, right? So that's kind of our mission. And we do that through 3 service lines. We do that through training, consulting, and resourcing. So that's in a kind of a summary. But one other thing I want to mention here, Julian, is, I'm talking, and as I'm talking, I'm hearing myself, and I'm moving between saying the terminology autistic people and people with autism.
Yes.
I think it's really important for anyone listening to this podcast that there is a difference in that terminology. And there is actually a debate within the autistic community themselves of which they prefer. And I'll try and explain the difference. So when you say person with autism, you're making that a person first terminology. And so autism is a condition they have, but it doesn't define their identity.
Yes.
Whereas when you say autistic person, obviously the autistic is defining their identity, right? And there is a bit of a debate within the autistic community, because actually if you ask someone who's autistic, most of them will say they prefer the term autistic person. But if you ask academics and read published papers and everything else, they still use the term person or people with autism. And so it's an important differentiation, because if you come across anyone from the autistic community, it's really important to understand what their preferences are, just as we do with gender, with gender labels and specifications. We now are open to much more than just female and male. So it's a very similar way. If you come across with someone who's autistic, it's really good to ask them, hey, do I say person with autism, or would you prefer autistic person?
And it's a very good point I think you're making, and I agree with you. I think it applies with so many elements when it comes to that diversity, and to create that sense of belonging of people is to have that openness and that vulnerability to say, well, I don't have all the answers, but I have a lot of questions, and I want to get to know you better, which comes through as well as you said, your preferences and how you want me to communicate to you, because at the end of the day, I'm not the specialist, and you are the specialist of your own identity. So you are the one who can tell me what works best for you. Indeed.
Absolutely.
And going a little bit more in detail on the work you do with organizations, what's the value in that concrete value for not just the organization actually, but the teams and the individuals working with people who are or with embracing that neurodiversity?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This is quite a unique thing actually for hiring from the autistic talent pool, and I'll explain why. So as we've already discussed, when you have a diverse workforce, you can see already there are benefits to the organization. Tangible benefits, like for example, they could have a stronger employee value proposition, which means they could attract maybe better talent, and that could affect their shareholding. There's many things that can happen that can hit the bottom line. And you can also have intangible benefits like better communication within the team or more innovation, because people are coming from different perspectives, right? So you can have different things that will contribute to the organization. Hiring from the autistic talent pool does the same things as those other benefits when you hire from other diverse backgrounds. However, there is a bigger contribution here, right? And this bigger contribution goes from a micro to a macro level. So I'll start with the micro. So if we look at a micro benefit, it benefits the individual, right? You have someone who may be on the spectrum, who isn't in full-time paid employment, who may be missing purpose in life, as well as financial stability. And if you don't have financial stability, how do you rent a place? How do you go about the world? How do you buy a car? How do you do the things that people, with a job would tend to do if you don't have that financial stability? So actually, it is helping on the individual level, right? Giving that person a sense of purpose or a meaning, or and financial stability.
Mm-hmm.
It helps the organization in the same ways I've just discussed, with improving communication or improving innovation, etc. But if we just look in a bit more deeper to that innovation point, because people on the spectrum literally think differently to what we call neurotypicals, right? Neurotypicals refers to people who are not on the spectrum. And because they think differently, it means they often can see problems to solutions that other team members might have come up with, or they might be really good with a specific skill set, like identifying patterns that neurotypicals may not be able to identify. Just a couple of examples. I think Auticon are a great organization who deliver autistic IT consultants for big IT projects to other organizations, and they have a really huge success case where they delivered some IT consultants to Siemens, and those IT consultants, who are autistic people, could spot and complete test cases much faster. I think it was 50% faster than neurotypicals, right? So that's just one example of how they're just wired slightly differently. So yes, you can get benefits from other diverse backgrounds, but I think the benefits you get from the autistic community are just slightly different, right? You can get some other benefits that you may not be able to realize with other diverse backgrounds. So that's an example of how the organization can benefit. Then going from that micro to macro again, let's look at society, right? How does society benefit? Well, actually, society, believe it or not, often look up to huge organizations to do the right thing, and then that trickles down and influences society, right? So when you look at your big organizations like your Google and your Facebook, and what they do to help the environment or to help the world influences society and people's thinking, right? So the more you can get organizations to say, hey, we're hiring from the autistic talent pool, the more those organizations are actually influencing society to start thinking differently with these group of people as well. And then from an economic, that's the biggest, on the micro to macro, that's the biggest, right? From an economic level, imagine people on the spectrum, if they're out of full-time paid employment, how are they covering their costs? Well, usually a lot of them have to tap into the government's welfare program, right? So whether you're in the UK, US, wherever you are, you have to tap into that government welfare program. And so you receive benefits in that way from the government. Obviously, that comes from the taxpayers' money. Now, if you can get these people who want to work into employment, you can save on the welfare costs that the government have to distribute to this population.
Completely,
right?
indeed.
So that's just one example. Another example on the economic level is it brings down the rate of unemployment that obviously most countries measure, right? It will bring it down, because if you can get these people into employment, then of course you're getting them to contribute to the economy, right? There was a great example in Australia. I'll try and remember it as best I can. But they put something like just 100 autistic people into employment, just 100, right? And remember that their rate is 1 in 70 are autistic in their country. They put 100 autistic people into employment. And what they found was within, I think it was the first 3 years, the government, the Australian government, had saved millions in welfare costs and in tax credentials too. So, and that was just 100. Now imagine you replicate that study and do it for more, right? So again, it just shows the power of hiring from the autistic talent pool. It's not just affecting the individual or the organization, it influences society and it helps the country on an economic level. Very true
indeed. Yeah. And it's these are very interesting numbers actually you're sharing, because it's we don't really always realize the impact it has, and the scale it can have indeed. And if we look at the organizations, so maybe some of the organizations you're working, what do you usually advise them to do to be able to be more inclusive of people with autism or autistic people?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I briefly mentioned we have 3 service lines: training, consulting, and resourcing. So I'll explain what they do. So the training really is there to help raise awareness in the organization. So we have, for example, the library of digital content. And when an organization comes to us saying, hey, we want to raise the awareness within our organization and we want employees to know what this is, because quite frankly, you've probably got some autistic folk within some industries and some organizations already, right? And managers may not know how to manage them. Team members may not know how to interact with their colleague. So you've probably already got some of this there. So what the digital content does that we provide is it helps the employees watching these they're engaging in bite-sized videos. So it helps the employees watching these engaging bite-sized videos just pick up on some tips and tricks that can help. So it raises awareness by telling them what autism is. It shows them some ways in which they can support autism. So really, really simple things that you may take for granted, but actually you don't know how that could impact someone who's on the spectrum. To give you an example, you might want a quiet area because most offices nowadays are open plan. Yes. And when they're open plan, the level of noise can go up. People might shout across different desks to someone else instead of going over. All those things might be really impactful for someone on the spectrum, right? So maybe creating a quiet space where they can walk away from that environment and be in a quiet space, maybe providing noise cancelling headphones as another example, right? Really small things, but actually make a world of difference for people on the spectrum. So what we do is we provide these videos that have these kind of bite-sized tips and tricks. Some videos are designed for employees, i.e. all the employees across the organization. Some videos are designed for managers on how to manage their autistic direct report. And they're also designed for different industries. So we have, for example, some training designed specifically for retail, some designed for more offices, and so there's different types. But the real objective behind the digital content we provide is to just help raise the awareness. Now, that is only one intervention. It doesn't solve the issue of building inclusivity and more acceptance, right?
It's an important start, as you said. But
it is. It's an important start. But this moves on to the consulting practice that we offer. And so what we do is we go into organizations. We have a neurodiversity maturity assessment tool that we use. So basically like a diagnostic tool. We go into organizations and we complete this diagnostic tool within about 3 days, right? And what we do is we interview different members of the organization across some of those days. And we have got a series of questions that they're all pre-populated within this tool. And we amalgamate the data. So it could be qualitative data as well as quantitative data. And so by the end of day 2, we've got a really good idea of where the organization are doing well, i.e. they're doing really great things when it comes to diversity and inclusion, but it also gives us a really good idea of where they can improve, right? And then by day 3, we have a report that we hand to the organization or present to the organization. And that report defines, okay, organization A will be, this is where you're doing really well, this is where you can improve, this is how we can help you improve, or of course, if they wish, they can do it internally. So our consulting practice starts with a diagnostic assessment. And then, of course, if organizations wish to hire us to actually carry out some of that inclusivity activities as well, we will do that. To give you an example of what kind of things we're talking about is, we'll be checking, what does their recruitment process look like? Is it inclusive, or is it not inclusive for people with hidden disabilities? I'll give you one really great example of an organization I'm working with currently. I can't name them, but their current recruitment process includes a situational questionnaire and a personality questionnaire. Now, for someone on the spectrum, those 2 things can be really challenging. Not for everyone, but they could be for quite a large majority. So, a situational questionnaire is judging how you respond to particular situations. This is all online, right? And a personality questionnaire is checking what your personality is like and if you're a good fit for the culture of the company. Now, if you get an autistic person to take those tests, they might fail those. They might not be on paper what the organization think they're looking for. Yet, if you gave them a chance to go and do the job, you might find that they excel in that job more than your neurotypical, right? So really, that's just one example, which is the recruitment process. Is the idea of our consulting practice is to go in and identify all the different facets within an organization of where they can improve. The recruitment process is usually a good one because usually there is improvements that can be made there. But there could be other things. Do they have support networks? Do they have ERGs, employee resource groups? What kind of communication they have? What have they set up? And what kind of adjustments can they provide? There's lots of different things that can be considered, but that's what our consulting practice does. But it all starts with this diagnostic tool, because the diagnostic tool gives us a baseline. Okay, this is where you're at, right? And then only from there can we work upwards and decide how we're going to create value, right? So that's our consulting practice. And then the final service we provide is resourcing. So this is where we work with organizations to identify roles that could be suitable for people on the spectrum. And then we help fulfill those roles with the autistic talent. So it's not it's not very similar to typical recruitment consultancy agencies or companies, because we have to turn it on its head slightly. A typical recruitment company will get a vacancy from an organization and then go out there to find the best candidate. We've had to find that doesn't always work the best way we want to do. Sometimes it can, but what we found is usually we'll meet the autistic candidates and then go out and find organizations and ask them and approach them. So we found that way we're really tailoring the role to the autistic person rather than getting the candidate for the role. Yeah. So, in summary, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, which ultimately is very interesting, because this is probably what you would want for any role in any organization, that the role is perfectly tailored to the individual, because that's where they're going to perform at their best. They're going to be the most motivated. They're going to be committed to the job. They're going to stay longer. And that solves a range of other issues as well, when it comes to recruitment and retention and so on. So yep. I think it sounds like a really great approach to it. I think, and I'm making an assumption here, but the hardest part possibly is to convince the organization to take that route, or to as you said, to take it upside down rather than the traditional way of doing things, maybe.
You're right. Organizations aren't used to thinking this way or doing things this way, because the way we've done recruitment has been the same for the last 20, 30, 40. It's been the same, right? We go with a CV or a resume, and we'll go to a job interview or several interviews. And really, what are they assessing? They're assessing our social skills and aptitude, right? Yes. They're not actually assessing our skills in the job. So there is a big idea around, have we got the right recruitment process in place? And a lot of organizations now, what they're doing is they're continuing their regular recruitment process, but actually they're starting to define one for people with hidden disabilities or other disabilities that need a different process in place. And organizations that are forward thinking and are taking the leap in this area are finding the benefits, right? So the four founding companies I mentioned, Microsoft, SAP, EY, and JP Morgan Chase, they set up this Autism at Work program. And what they found 7, 8, 9 years on is that on average, their retention rate for the people they've hired from the spectrum is about 90%. Now, if you compare that to a neurotypical who'll be doing the same job, again, it depends on a variety of factors, but let's say you've got a neurotypical under the age of 35. Usually they'll stay in role for about 2.8 years. And let's say you've got a neurotypical over the age of 35, that might change to 4 years, right? They'll stay in role for 4 years. These people they've recruited are still there 7, 8, 9 years on, right? So the loyalty and the retention is very high. Again, one of the biggest benefits to organizations from hiring from the autistic talent pool, because again, that saves on recruitment costs, it saves on training costs. There's so many benefits from retaining your staff, right?
Yeah, and it's very interesting to see to look at it like this, because indeed these are those kind of long-term hidden benefits, or slightly more hidden benefits than the ones you can think of at the very beginning, but actually they are extremely powerful and extremely important for any organization who wants to create that environment where indeed they have people. I mean, they're able to bounce back when things are difficult. Like we just had a pandemic. When you have people who've been in the organization for a long time and know it well, and they're part of the core of the organization, then that definitely has an extremely important impact for anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are there's a population within the autistic community itself that are happy to do repetitive tasks, right? So you give a neurotypical repetitive task, they might last 6 months, a year, or even 18 months, but then they're probably done with that and they want to move on to a new challenge. There are a lot of autistic candidates out there who are happy to do that task over and over again, because actually they enjoy the familiarity with the task and they enjoy the routine. So again, it means that your churn for those particular roles can be reduced, right? So
when you were saying that, I could see myself from above actually being distracted very easily and wanting to change. But indeed, there are a number of tasks as well that need to have that regularity, and that's where again that diversity of people and differences that and preferences that each of us have for certain roles is going to be very important. So I'm glad you highlighted that as well, because I think we forget actually sometimes some of these elements every single one of us is bringing to the table that actually creates that strong environment. I mean, I was reading actually an article about someone who is who said they were diagnosed with autism as well, and they were talking about their skills that they were bringing, and things like attention to details and focus and commitment, while others in the spectrum it might bring things, not these skills specifically, but others as well that are very much needed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, there are a huge range of benefits, but I think the important thing is making sure the organization are aware on how to attract people from the autistic talent pool, and then not just attract them, putting the right processes in place to interview them, or whether they have a work assessment or whatever else, and then retain them, right? Which means that they need ongoing support within the organization. That support can look like many different things, but they need to have that available to them, right? Yep. So it's really trying to get organizations to start thinking differently. And yes, they have to probably put more upfront investment than hiring from neurotypicals. But actually, if they get it right, that upfront investment pays back, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. There's another, bringing it down a little bit, maybe from the organizational level to more individual level. There was a question I was asking myself, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, is what does someone with autism or an autistic person need from an ally in the workplace? So at an individual level.
So yeah, it's a very good question. And actually, it varies significantly. Again, it would go back to that saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But I think it's kind of what most of us want, right? If you've got a condition or a disability or whatever you want to call it, what do you want from that? You want to be able to share that. You want to be able to disclose that. You want to be able to have the right support levels, right? So for someone with autism, and this can vary because, again, the spectrum is so vast, but just to give you a few examples, that could look like a safe place to speak. So connecting a network of people who are autistic within the organization, connecting them together. It could look like having a job coach. So especially if they are new to the role. So it doesn't just mean when they're first recruited, but if they move role at any point, they could have a job coach. The job coach helps them through the change and the expectations of the job, right? You could have training in place for managers. So obviously we provide digital training. That might not be enough for a particular type of organization. You might need to, if you're a customer-facing organization, you might need to have your staff understand what an autistic customer might look like, right? And therefore how to ensure that you manage those customers correctly so that they can keep coming back to you. There's many things that can be put in place. It will depend holistically on the organization, the industry, the types of roles. Those things put together can change the levels of support, but it's no different, as I mentioned, it's no really different from any other types of allies that, say, for example, the LGBTQ plus community might need.
Very good. Thank you very much. I can see we've spent already quite a bit of time together. I'm loving it. It's learning so much from it. But I do want to ask you a last question, actually. If
Sure.
what would be one word of wisdom you would want to leave us with?
Oh, that's a very good question. So in the work that we're doing, the biggest challenge I find when I work with organizations is they are open to diversity. It's a big thing, up and coming, and it's huge, right, in different areas. So they're absolutely open to diversity. But it's really understanding what's going to make them more inclusive, right? So, there's a real balance between, I'll give you an example, right? And I'll come to the word of wisdom in a minute. But I'm working with an organization where they're happy to look at an alternative recruitment process. So for example, not the interviews, but maybe a work assessment so that someone on the spectrum can go and try the job for maybe half a day and be assessed on that, right? However, they still have, the assessors still have particular forms that they need to complete. And this is a customer-facing role. So those forms are the same forms for neurotypicals as they are for, the neurodiverse. So for things like, they'll have one line where they need to ensure that the person that they're assessing can smile appropriately with customers. Actually, if someone on the spectrum, that might be very difficult because they can't always understand social cues and norms. So there's a real balance between having a standard process that means that the employer are seen as an employer of equality across all candidates versus changing the process to ensure they're inclusive.
Yep.
So my word of wisdom is there's a lot of organizations I think who want to do a lot more out there. And I think there is some hesitancy. And I would say hire people who are subject matter experts and hire people who will be able to change your organization to make it more inclusive, and don't be afraid for that balance and making sure that we're doing the right thing and getting that balance right. Don't not do it because of fear, which is what I'm finding when I speak to a lot of organizations. They're just not sure which way to go, so it's easier not doing it, right? So I hope that helped.
I think it's a great way to close our conversation, because I think it very often comes back to that fear of what could happen if I jump in and actually if I get it wrong.
If they get it wrong. So that's my view. Just hire the expertise, don't be afraid, and let's get the balance right, because you still want to be an equal opportunities employer, but you still want to put in some inclusive practices to ensure you're actually capturing all the talent pool, right?
Thank you.
So,
last thing I would want to ask you is if anyone wants to learn more about neurodiversity in general, but autism specifically, wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do it?
Oh, absolutely. So we have our website, which is live. It's aubilities.com. If not, we also have our email address, info@aubilities.com. And of course, anyone is more than welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn or connect with our company profile on LinkedIn as well. We do often post a lot around there. And me personally, I post a lot about my son. So there's a lot of stories if anyone wants to know how he's getting on and how we're getting on with his autism.
And those stories are important. They're part of that journey. So thank you so much for sharing them. And we'll share in the notes of the episode as well all the links for people to be able to reach out to you.
Great. Thank you, Julian. It was really lovely.
Thank you so much as well. Thank you so much for being here. I learned very much, and I'm sure we'll have the chance to have you again for, maybe we'll have you again for a bit more of a deep dive on some of these other topics. But I think it was a great way to learn more about neurodiversity, about what we can do at an organizational level, but also at an individual level. So thank you so much for that.
No, you're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.